again. You guys really ought to come to Sunday school, because it was basically my sermon in the New Testament. This morning we're going to be talking about Abraham, Father Abraham. You all have been a part of the church, and maybe if you haven't, you've heard the song, Father. Yeah, I'm not singing it. This will be a quick service because you'd all run. But how many of you have really heard about Father Abraham? I mean, he is one of the earliest teachings as kids. He's one of those names that everybody has heard of. He has a huge role in the world. And it's actually been said that there is no greater worldwide influence than Abraham, and that's even considering greater influence, not greater work, but greater influence than even Jesus himself. Now, when I first read that, I was like, now wait a minute. I mean, I'm all about Jesus, right? And so I got to thinking about that, and the more you really consider the line of Abraham and what has come out of that, it's really true. When God opened up and he gave this promise to Abraham, he said that his descendants would be as numerous as the dirt of the earth and the stars in the sky. And look how that played out. Now you think of where we are now as Christians coming into the line of Abraham, and how many billions of followers of Christianity have there been? And then what about Judaism itself? I mean, he is the patriarch of Judaism. And you think even now there's still over 15 million followers? What about Islam? Now, we don't really talk about that a whole lot, but their patriarch is Abraham. And so you think about the widespread billions and billions of people that this one man is associated with. His influence is indescribable. So this week we're going to look at this man, Abraham, and the covenant that God made with him. Now this is another covenant that is also an everlasting covenant. And so interesting things about who is Abraham. Well, he was the 10th great-grandson, 10th generational grandson to Noah. Noah was the 10th great-grandson to Adam. Therefore, Abraham is a direct descendant of Adam and Eve. I think that's really cool. So when I was a kid, I didn't really get that when you read the Bible and how God worked through these people, they were literally connected to one another. I mean, this is spanning hundreds of years, and we'll go farther into thousands of years, and it's all one story out of one family. And it's this really awesome picture that God puts together for us. So as we dig in this morning, we're going to come across a main theme, one that has been from last week into this one, which is God keeps his promises. That is just something that keeps flowing out of this story. So this morning we're going to be in hitting Genesis 12 through 22. I thought about reading the whole thing, but I'll get hungry, so that's probably not going to happen. So anyway, that's something that we see is God keeps his promises, and that we serve a God who's going to keep his promises. So to go alongside that, God keeps his promises even when we get in the way, and when we try to do something good only causing more damage. God still comes out on top each and every time, thankfully. One thing that I continually find peace in is knowing that these guys like Abraham, this patriarch over billions of people that look to him as sort of the father of the faith, was still human, still had sin in his life, still struggled with temptations, still tried to do things their own way. Abraham is known of the father of many nations. In the New Testament is called the father of the faithful, and is the patriarch of God's chosen people. So this morning we're going to start with the call on Abram. If you don't know, Abram was what he was called before Abraham, so we'll start there. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 9. The Lord said to Abram, "Go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who treat you with contempt, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions that he had accumulated and the people he had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the site of Shechem at the oak of Moreh. At the time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "I will give this land to your offspring." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. He built an altar to Yahweh there and called on the name of Yahweh. Then Abram journeyed by stages to the Negev. There's a lot of history wrapped up in this. So the history starts in the Ur of the Chaldees, in which is now what we would call southern Iraq, a predominantly pagan city of about 250,000 people at the time. In the center was a temple to the moon god Sin, which is ironic. Here, Abram's father, Terah, was thought to have been a craftsman within the moon cult. And at a crucial turning point in history, and for reasons we don't know, Terah, his father, and various members of his family determined to travel to Canaan. And upon going, they left everything they knew. Everything they knew. And they hit the road. And so they go as far as Haran, which is another center of moon worship in trade routes between what we know as Syria and Turkey. The allure of this pagan city detained them. They stayed there for a while. When they stopped at some point in time in that place, Abram's father, Terah, died. So Abram was called to leave his father's home in order to go into a land which the Lord would show him. There's a lot of back context. I would really encourage you studying this. This is amazing, how God pulled this man out. And so with his wife and nephew and the people he had gotten in Haran, he ventured out again into the unknown. He took a step of faith, which is really not unlike to our stepping out in faith into Christianity when we give our lives to Christ, abandoning everything behind and only following Jesus. And so in this section, there are two promises given to Abram. First, that God would give them a land that he would show them, and that he would become a great nation. Furthermore, Abram would be blessed in his walk with God. That blessing would fulfill itself in greatness. His name is considered the exalted Father. He would be the Father, right? So he would become a source of blessing to others. God was focusing the whole of salvation history into one family, into one line of people. From that family, the whole world would be blessed, is what it says. Yet every single person who opposes this family, God says, "I will curse them." So at 75 years old, Abram obeyed the call of God. He left, he went to Canaan. But it was there that the Lord appeared to Abram and promised him this land. And he staked his claim, and he made an altar to God. So from there, Abram and his entire family moved into a mountain east of Bethel. And so what they say is that when he pitched his tent there, it represented a departure from everything of the world. The territory was unknown because there were roads, not much different than what we have. They traveled by roads, by routes, and so they left all of that. He built an altar and he called on God, and for the next 25 years, they would travel, and God would reach down and speak to Abram multiple different times. God would send the message of the nations that would be built through his lineage. God would show him the land that his people would dwell in. God was making a promise to him, but would only be fulfilled in God's timing. So we jump to chapter 15. That covers 12, 13, 14. So in chapter 15, we see God giving Abraham this promise, and then we see a response from Abraham. In Genesis 15, verses 5 through 6, it says that he took him outside and said, "Look at the sky and count the stars if you're able to count them." Then he said to him, "Your offspring will be that numerous." Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Now this little gem here leads us to the New Testament, because it says that Abraham believed by faith, and God credited it to him as righteousness, okay? So these verses shape the fulfillment that we see in that. As we continue, we're going to read about the sign of the covenant and the importance that it was, but think about this last part. In Romans, Paul talks about this very thing. We also see it in Galatians as well. Romans chapter 4, "And he received the sign of the circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while still uncircumcised. This was to make him the father of all who believed but are not circumcised." Okay, that is a really key part, so that the righteousness may be credited to them also. And Abraham became the father of the circumcised, who are not only circumcised, but who also follow in the footsteps of the faith of our father Abraham while he was still uncircumcised. Now that may be a little confusing. So what Paul is saying is that because God found Abram righteous before the covenant, even before the sign of the covenant, that he can be the rightful father of the faith for those who were of the uncircumcised, that is, non-Jews. So as we see in the New Testament, the issue, and in Galatians especially, we see Jews saying, well, you must be circumcised. And Paul's saying, no, because Abraham was credited as righteousness before, shows that he is the father of all. Does that make sense? I really hope so. I don't really know how else to say it. So, God was working out thousands of years before Christ how this covenant would be implemented into the coming generations and how God would provide a way for anyone, Jew or not, to come to that right relationship with him. And so in the middle of all of this happening, we have this interjection of the human side trying to take control of God's plan by this person named Hagar and the son named Ishmael. If you don't know, it's through Genesis 16. But this is where we see Abram and Sarai. They've heard God. They said, I'm going to make you a great nation, your offspring. But they struggle, apparently, with the clarity of this message. So at this point, time has passed. Abram is between the ages of 85 and 86 at this time. Sarai was obviously already past the point of being able to have children. So it would seem logical that they would know better than God's plan and try and step in. Well, at least Abram's wife Sarai did. She basically sent her servant Hagar to be with Abram, and she got pregnant. Okay, she got pregnant, and so when Abram was 86, she gave birth to this boy named Ishmael. Have you ever read the Bible and thought this could be a 2018 reality show? Oh my goodness, it's crazy, right? Yeah. Try preaching this. Sometimes we read the Bible and we're like, what is wrong with you people? Hello? But God has a plan. And he sets this plan, and it's a very direct plan for Abram and Sarai. But in their own infinite wisdom, they chose to try and supersede God's will in a way to force God to move. And as we see time and time again throughout Scripture, that doesn't work out well. So after Ishmael's born, Sarai begins mistreating Hagar with contempt, treating her poorly, and blaming Abram for her problems, which she created. And so Hagar ran away, and she left them for a while, and Ishmael stayed with Abram. So that's a fun story. So Genesis chapter 17, this is a time where Abram becomes Abraham, Sarai becomes Sarah, and God once again speaks to Abraham, and this is the wording here is I will. This is God speaking. So just pay attention to how often God speaks this word. He says, starting in verse 1, and I've kind of broken it up into a couple different sections. I am God Almighty. Live in my presence and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell face down, and God spoke with him. As for me, my covenant is with you. You will become the father of many nations. Your name will no longer be Abram, but you will be Abraham, for I will make you the father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful, and I will make nations and kings come from you. I will keep my covenant between me and you and your future offspring throughout their generations, as an everlasting covenant to be your God and the God of your offspring after you. And to you and your future offspring I will give the land where you are residing, all the land of Canaan as an essential possession, and I will be their God. God also said to Abraham, as for you and your offspring after you throughout their generations are to keep my covenant. Verse 10, this is my covenant which you are to keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every one of your males must be circumcised. You must circumcise the flesh of your foreskin to serve as a sign of the covenant between me and you. And down to verse 15, God said to Abraham, as for your wife Sarai, do not call her Sarai, for Sarah will be her name. I will bless her, indeed. I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will produce nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Abraham fell face down, then he laughed and said to himself, can a child be born to a 100-year-old man? Can Sarah, a 99-year-old woman, give birth? So Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael were acceptable to you. But God said, no, your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac. I will confirm my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for this future offspring. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will certainly bless him. I will make him fruitful and will multiply him greatly. He will father 12 tribal leaders, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will confirm my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. When he finished talking with him, God withdrew from Abraham. So with this passage in mind, what's the covenant? And how will they show that it's been established? The big key thing here is God saying, I will. Does anybody count how many times he said that just in that passage? 16 times. God said, I will do this. We've learned about God and his promises, that he always keeps his promises. God said that Sarah would bear Abraham a son even at the age of 99. Now, even for them, they thought that was a crazy idea. I mean, they already had Ishmael. Why not just use him as the rightful heir? Well, God already said, I will make you a great nation. And so, you ever heard the term, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? God says to do something and he will do something, let him do it. So then God says, I'm going to make a covenant with you, which is an everlasting one. But in order for there to be this covenant, we got to have a sign. You know, like Noah had the sign of the rainbow, right? Well, I'm going to ask you for like a physical sign. I'm just going to say Abraham was a really faithful guy. No questions asked. From what we see, there was no hesitation. But he says, there has to be a circumcision, and so this man of God was faithful to perform his duties on himself, his children, his slaves, every male person in his family. That was a fun day. Just a side note, when you read through the law and the things that God established that you read through later, there were a lot of these things that God would call his people to do or not do that were for actual physical health reasons. There were real practical reasons for doing this. Circumcision is one of those things, but there were a lot of things God said, don't touch this, don't touch dead bodies. I mean, because of diseases that can harm you and destroy multitudes of people. So God did things. He used this one as a sign for the covenant. So, moving on. Over the next year, many things would take place. God comes down and he meets with Abraham. And from what we read, it looks like 2 angels accompanying him. They speak with him and tell him that Sodom and Gomorrah are going to be destroyed. See, when I was a kid, I heard all these stories, but I didn't realize how they flowed like they do. And so Abraham, being a godly man, he's already in this covenant relationship with God, pleads for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah is like Vegas on steroids. Bad place. And you can read about some of the things that the people were doing in this section. It's gross. So ultimately, Abraham pleads, said, if there's 50 people, would you destroy it? No, I won't. Well, but God's like, now go find 50 people. And that basically he can't. And so he says, well, my nephew's there. Let me go get my nephew. So anyway, God's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. These 2 towns are going to be wiped out. Lot, his wife, and their 2 daughters are the only ones that leave. Okay? What's really cool, I thought was the coolest story in the Bible when I was a kid. They're leaving, and God rains down burning sulfur on these 2 cities, and Lot's wife turns around, and she looks back, and what happens to her? Turns into a pillar of salt. I thought that was the coolest thing. I mean, it was a bummer for her and them, but I thought it was a really cool story. But their story even gets a little weird after that, too. In chapter 20, Abraham is on the move again. In his infinite wisdom, he chooses to, as he meets this king, he chooses to tell the king that his wife is actually his sister, and come to find out she kind of actually was his sister, half-sister. Weird family relationships, okay? But anyway, so because Abraham's like, this king's going to kill me because he wants my wife, so she's my sister, and so they have this issue. Are you just surprised by some of the weird decisions people make? They make these odd decisions that they think in that moment, this is right. And God's like, no, this really is not right. So the decisions that were made had effects on this king's family, and after all that was said and done, they were able to move on in this peaceful way, thankfully. And then it happens. Sarah's been pregnant, and she gives birth to their son Isaac, the one that this promise would be given. And so in Genesis 22, God fulfills this part of his promise, that I will give you a son, that Sarah will have a son, you'll name him Isaac. And so in God's infinite wisdom, all right, Abraham, you've trusted me up till now. So now that you have your one and only son, the rightful heir to my kingdom, let's just read in chapter 22 what God tells him to do next. Take your son, he said, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Well, gee, thanks, God. That's a rough one. Now, what's interesting is you jump down, Abraham did it. He went, he took his son. So in verse 9, when they arrive at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar, and he arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He placed him on the altar on top of the wood, and Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. Now, if you read extra biblical texts or people who are not Christians, they will say God is a maniac. He's crazy. Why would anyone ask them to kill their one and only son that this line would come from? And I think they forget to keep reading. As Abraham was about to kill his own son, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he replied, "Here I am." "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, this is the Lord's declaration. Because you have done this thing and have not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the gates of their enemies, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring, because you have obeyed my command." Abraham, the father of the faithful, a man who is willing to give up his one and only son because he trusted God that God would answer and fulfill the promises he gave. So he was willing enough to take his son and to take a knife and to slaughter his own son because he knew that God would answer the promises that God set before him. Can you see faithfulness in that? That's pretty amazing to me. Abraham is named among many listed in Hebrews as champions of the faith. We're reminded of his faithfulness to uproot everything he had, everything he had known, and to just go where God would lead him, to a land that God would show him at some point. He stepped out literally in faith. He and Sarah had faith that God would honor his promise to give them a son, that he would be their heir that would bring about great nations. If you read past this story, you soon see how God almost immediately begins to answer the very promises spoken to Abraham early on. When he was told to uproot to begin to walk, did they mess up? Did they try to do things their own way? Yeah, you betcha. Pretty big ways. But what we see through that is God remained faithful through all of it. God keeps his promises despite our ignorance, despite our selfishness, despite us. God keeps every promise he lays before them. So what does this have to do with me and you? I hope that by now that's a pretty clear answer to that. Are we followers of the Old Testament? No. So how does this fit into the context of 2018? As Christians in this room, God said that this was an everlasting covenant, one that will remain forever until the return of Christ. Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham, and I am one of them. So are you. So let's all praise the Lord. We as Christians are grafted into this family. We are under the promise that God gave Abraham thousands and thousands of years ago. We are living in this same promise. We are living the inheritance of the promise that God gave. In Galatians 3:29, we talked about it this morning. And if you belong to Christ, you are then Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. One story through thousands of years, and we are living with the greatest gift to be God's chosen people. It means that we get to be a part of this family, that we come from the line of Abraham himself, and we are given this gift freely to have eternal life, to be partners and heirs of the greatest promise ever given. So will we remain faithful with the promises that God has given us? Will we live a life that is focused on our faithfulness to God as He is faithful to us? Now, there will be times where we will be like Abraham and Sarah and do things our own way, and we'll mess up. But God is always faithful. He is always there to bring us back. This is a gift that's offered to every single person